Oh, remind me if you have time at the end to come back to the very end of digestion, because I'd like to tell you about that one last slide we didn't get to. So, we're talking about how organisms maintain homeostasis, and we learn now about feedback systems. We've talked about muscles and energy, gas exchange, etc. So one important system, one important life function related to homeostasis is transport. To transport things from one part of the organism to another. That's a key factor.
Why does this happen?
What is that?
It's a tree of life.
No?
It's a dude. It's a tree.
Come on, no one?
It's a tree guy.
It's an ant.
What?
An ant. No Lord of the Rings fans in here?
No.
Sad. The youth of today. Yeah, the Hobbit. There's ants in Lord of the Rings. But anyway, that's what that is. So all organisms need to be able to transport substances from one place to another. Now, in some organisms, it's pretty simple. In a single-celled bacteria, material can just diffuse through the cytoplasm from one place to another. Okay? Or in other organisms, there might be the ER, which transports material within the cell. But in more complex and larger organisms, there's special tissues and organs and systems that are required to move things around from one place to another. So plants have to move things from one place to another. Where's water taken into a plant? In the roots. And it then has to be moved to other parts. All the parts of this tree, for example, need water. So in order to move that water from one place to another, it has special tissues which allow that to happen. The roots also are important to anchor and hold on to the plant, keep it anchored in the ground. They also absorb nutrients that are in the soil, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, as well as water. And they bring that material in to the vascular tissue. The vascular tissues are the parts of the plant that actually move this material around. We learned about it when we looked at cells. We were looking at and talked about photosynthesis. We saw those vascular bundles in slides of the leaf cross-section. Those were these tubes that are carrying things around. Okay, there's two types of tubes, the xylem and the phloem. The xylem is the one that moves water from one part of the plant to another. And the phloem is what brings sugars from one part of the plant to another. Another thing, the roots have very, very tiny little hairs, okay, that are attached to them. And like many organisms that are absorbing materials, the purpose of those roots is to increase the surface area, increase the amount of area where diffusion can happen so that they can absorb the maximum amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide and so forth. The xylem and phloem are important right about now in our area, because what are people doing with maple trees in the coming weeks? Tapping them. So by tapping a maple tree and hammering a small metal spout into it, part of that goes into this vascular tissue, and then in the spring, when nutrients and sugars that were stored over the winter in the roots are making their way back up to the upper portions of the tree, they're going there to provide energy to grow new leaves in the spring. And so as that material is moving up the stem of the tree, you can tap it, drain some of it, boil away the water, and what we're left with is maple syrup. And that's maple syrup comes from this vascular tissue in the trees. And so here you see that xylem carrying water up from the roots up to the other parts of the plants, and the phloem carrying sugars down from the leaves and so forth down to the lower parts of the plant. Okay, and that's in the outer edges here. That's why you can just hammer in this tap into the tree, and it doesn't have to go all the way to the center of the tree. It just goes into this outer vascular tissue. And animals have systems of transport, and there's different ways that animals can move material around. We'll use earthworms as an example. Earthworms have what we call a closed circulatory system. What that means is the blood is always held within blood vessels. So earthworms have these blood vessels that transport the blood from one part of the worm to another. They have those 5, they're called aortic arches or accessory hearts, sometimes they're called. And their purpose is to pump that blood through the circulatory system. Interesting thing about worms, they actually don't have red blood cells. Their hemoglobin is just in the plasma of the blood, and that's what's holding oxygen. They don't have those red blood cells that we think of as most other animals have. Still, their blood carries oxygen and nutrients and so forth, and just distributes it down to different parts of the organism.
So that we've heard
It's just part of a reproductive organ of the worm. The grasshopper or another insect has another type of circulatory system. Insects have open circulatory systems. What that means is the blood isn't contained within blood vessels throughout the organ. There are some blood vessels, but what happens is actually blood is pumped through a blood vessel, and then it just sort of drips down and fills up the rest of their body cavity. And so it's not in blood vessels once it comes out of that part of the circulatory system. Also, their blood is a little bit different. They don't have hemoglobin and red blood cells. Remember, we talked about gas exchange. Insects have these tubes that go directly from the outside into the tissues of the insect, providing oxygen in that way, rather than the oxygen being transported around via blood.
Then why do you need blood?
Good question. Why do you need blood? It's not to transport oxygen.
Oh, to keep you warm.
No. To transport other nutrients, for example, as the grasshopper digests materials, that's transported through the blood. But that's a good question. So it doesn't carry carbon dioxide or oxygen, but it does carry nutrients. Also, it helps to carry weight. So here you see sort of those two opposing systems. Closed circulatory system versus an open circulatory system. Talk about humans for a little bit. Name that movie? Oh, good. What's he holding?
Heart.
Yeah, heart. So in humans, we obviously have a closed circulatory system. Our blood is held within blood vessels throughout our body. We have a heart to pump that blood around. Humans, like other mammals and birds, have a 4-chambered heart. So this is a model of the heart. I'll pass this around. It opens up. You can see the inside. This is the realistic size heart. The color's not realistic, but the red and the blue and the blood vessels is the distinguish between arteries and veins. So our circulatory system in humans consists of the heart, as well as arteries, veins, and capillaries, and our blood. We have about 4 to 6 liters of blood, a gallon and a half or so of blood throughout our body. And our blood is actually considered a tissue. It's several cells, several types of cells working together, so it's a tissue. It contains different parts, which we'll talk about. And our blood is important because it does several things. So obviously it carries oxygen and nutrients, but also it helps in fighting off infection and pathogens. Okay, it helps seal up damage by clotting, helps redistribute heat in our body. We just learned about that as we talked about homeostasis. So all of those functions are important for our circulatory system.
Is that the band Heart?
Yeah, nobody's gotten that reference yet. Yeah, that is the band.
Barracuda.
Yeah, some Barracuda, that's hard.
Oh, I hear that.
So if we look at the blood, it's not just like a red liquid. It's made of a bunch of different component parts. So The components of the blood are carried in a liquid that's called the plasma. It's most of our blood. If the blood is separated and centrifuged, you could see it's like a yellowish liquid. The red blood cells form the other majority of the rest of the blood here, okay, about 45%. But then there's a small section of other white blood cells and platelets as well. So our blood is made of the plasma. You can see it here. This is actual blood that's been centrifuged. The plasma is on top. See it here. Most of it is water, but it has some dissolved proteins and stuff in it as well. In its transportation system for the rest of the components of the blood, the red blood cells and white blood cells, platelets, kind of floating around in this plasma, being carried through the circulatory system. It's also where most carbon dioxide is dissolved. So we know that our blood helps to take carbon dioxide from our cells and help remove it in our lungs. So most of that carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood, in the plasma of the blood. Right? It also helps act as a buffer, keeping the blood pH regulated, maintaining homeostasis. Floating around in there are the red blood cells. Here you can see red blood cells. They have a distinct shape. Okay? They have this, it's called a biconcave disc. It's kind of like an indented, it's almost like a bagel, but the hole's not all the way through it. Like a frisbee or something. So the red blood cells actually bind, they have hemoglobin in them. Hemoglobin is a molecule that contains iron in it that can actually latch on to oxygen and transport it from one place to another. Our red blood cells actually have no nucleus in them. They have a nucleus when they first are produced through cell division, but then that nucleus sort of disappears and they're left with a very simple structure because their only function is to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have about, in 1 milliliter of blood, cubic milliliter, there's 5 million red blood cells. So they're small. They're constantly being produced and destroyed as they're no longer useful. The blood cells are made in our bones, actually. The bone marrow is where these blood cells are produced. Platelets are these tiny, small little things that you see in this blood smear slide. And the platelets are what's responsible for our blood clotting. Okay? So these aren't actually cells, they're fragments of cells. Okay? They're smaller than red blood cells and white blood cells. And their job, as we just read about in what we went over this morning, is for our blood to clot. So sometimes we think of blood clots as something that's harmful, and they can be if they don't form at the correct place or at the correct time. But our blood clotting is important because it helps to seal up damage to blood vessels, helps to stop bleeding, helps the healing process. They're produced also in the bone marrow. They require vitamin K, and if a person was to be deficient in vitamin K, then they may have a difficulty with platelet formation, and their blood may not clot properly. There are also people that are born with a genetic disorder called hemophilia. Hemophilia is when the platelets don't function correctly. This affected the royal families of Europe in the 1800s. And part of that is because of intermarrying within families to keep sort of the bloodline pure in these royal families. That led to an increase once this disease sort of arose in the family. It just was perpetuated because of that. And when a person has hemophilia and their blood's not clotting properly, it means if they get an injury, they could bleed excessively. They bruise very easily because they're bleeding under the skin. And so an injury that wouldn't be life-threatening for somebody with normal blood clotting ability could be life-threatening for a person with hemophilia. Also, sometimes blood clots form in the wrong place at the wrong time. And these are the ones that can cause serious health problems. If a blood clot forms inside of a blood vessel, okay, and floats around, it's called an embolus, it can float around through the circulatory system, and then if it gets stuck and gets lodged in an important artery or an important capillary, it can cause a lack of blood flow to that part. So if this blood clot were to find its way into the coronary arteries, okay, it would prevent blood from getting to the heart and could lead to a heart attack. If it got lodged somewhere providing oxygen to the brain, it could cut off the flow of blood to the brain and lead to a stroke or some other problem. So there are medications people can take which help to reduce the amount of clotting that is happening in their blood if they have these sorts of problems. Then we have another component of the blood, white blood cells. So white blood cells are a part of our body's immune system. They do have a nucleus. They are typically far fewer white blood cells than red blood cells. They're similar in size, or some of them are larger than white blood cells. And our body's immune system is very complex, actually. There's many different types of cells with different functions. Some recognize pathogens, some destroy pathogens, some produce antibodies to remember those pathogens in the future. So our immune system is really complex. One type of white blood cell, its job is to sort of act like an amoeba and engulf and destroy pathogens, okay, called phagocytes. And our body typically adapts to an infection by producing more white blood cells. So if we have an active infection, our body will produce more white blood cells to help to destroy that infection and help to keep us healthy. Here you see an example. These are orange things are some bacteria being engulfed by a phagocyte, which is going to destroy them. Here's another one, different type of cell. So let's talk a little bit about the system itself. So our heart is sort of the driver of our circulatory system. Okay. And our heart has 4 chambers, as we said earlier. Each side of the heart, the right versus the left, has sort of deals with a different system of circulation. The right side of the heart, okay, this side of the heart is the part of the heart that receives blood that's coming from the various parts of the body, from our brain and our legs and our muscles and so forth. That blood, because it's coming from all these body parts, it's deoxygenated. It's already given up its oxygen. And so it's returning back to the heart. Where is it destined to go?
Back to the body.
But it wouldn't be very useful just going back out to the body. It's already deoxygenated, so.
You breathe it out?
How? It's going to go to the lungs. And in the lungs, that blood gets recharged. It gets new oxygen. It gets rid of its carbon dioxide, and then it's ready to go to all the parts of the body again. The left side of the heart is what receives that blood from the lungs and then pumps it out to all the parts of the body. The heart itself has arteries that supply it with oxygen. They're called these coronary arteries. They're extremely important. When you hear about people that have a blockage in a coronary artery, you may have heard about people or relatives saying, oh, I have my one coronary is blocked 90%. It means fats have built up, and one of those coronary arteries, or several of them, blood is not flowing through them effectively, and the heart's not getting its supply of oxygen, and therefore can't work as well. I'm sure you've heard of blood pressure. You go to the doctor, they check your blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff like that. And when does anyone had their blood pressure measured recently and know what it was? How do they phrase it usually? Yeah, it's like a larger number over a smaller number, right? 110 over 70 or 120 over 80. Those two numbers mean two different things. So first off, blood pressure is measuring how much force is your blood pressing against your arteries. Okay? what do you think the higher number would be? It's when something is happening in your circulatory system. What would exert high pressure when what's going on? When blood's being actively pumped. When the ventricle contracts and forces blood into the arteries, obviously that increases the pressure on the blood. That's the first number. The second number is when the heart relaxes and the pressure drops. Okay, so they're called systole and diastole. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting and the pressure is higher. Diastole is when the ventricles have relaxed.
Why did they like stop half? Like they'll like get it. So, like,
Yeah.
just, like stop and then they do it.
What they're measuring, so the way you measure blood pressure, so you put this cuff on, and what's the other tool they need? A stethoscope. So they're listening to the arteries in your arm. They pump up the cuff until they can't hear your heart. They can't hear your heart rate anymore. And at that point, the pressure in the cuff is equal to the pressure while your heart is beating. And then what do? They slowly let the air come back in, and at some point they can hear your pulse rate start up again, and that allows them to get back. Our heart, the beating of our heart is controlled by special tissue in the heart, and it works on an electrical system. Okay? So there are nerves which tell our heart when to contract, which part of the heart to contract at the right time. And it's controlled by this AV node is what it's called. And it establishes our heartbeat. It adjusts, when we're exercising, our heart rate increases, resting it decreases, and as long as it's properly functioning, keeps our heart on track, providing our body with what it needs. In some people, this electrical signal is not working properly. Okay? And so my mom just had this problem a few months ago, okay, that her heart rate was dropping too low. So we go to the doctor and so forth, and what eventually they did to fix the problem is they gave her a pacemaker. A pacemaker is a little electrical, it's about this big, electrical device that they put in. They put it under your skin, up in your shoulder area. And then it has these wires that they thread into your blood vessels, and they thread them so they go to the part of the heart here where that electrical signal comes from. And now this little piece of equipment now is monitoring my mother's heart rate. And if her heart rate starts to drop below 60, it senses that, it kicks in, and it sends an electrical signal to keep her heart on track, because the heart muscle itself isn't doing it properly. That's what a pacemaker is. So when we look at sort of the overall circulation of our heart, here are the chambers. So we have 4 chambers in our heart. They're called the left atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. As always with anatomy, when you look at it on a paper, it's reversed, because we're imagining if this heart is in my body, it's my right hand, this is my right side, this is my right atrium and right ventricle. As we said earlier, right side of the heart is dealing with deoxygenated blood. It's fed by these 2 large tubes coming in here, one here, one here. It's called the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Where do you think this blood is coming from? That's in the inferior vena cava.
It's already been used.
Yeah, and where in the body is this coming from?
Muscles.
Yeah, this is coming, all the blood from the lower body is coming up into this inferior vena cava. This one
Upper body.
is the blood coming from the upper parts of the body into the heart. From the right atrium, the blood is transferred into the right ventricle. The right atrium contracts, squeezes blood into the right ventricle. Throughout the heart, there are these little valves as well. These valves stop the blood from going in the wrong direction. This is like a little one-way door that allows blood to go this way, but not back up into the right atrium. That's a valve. This is called the tricuspid valve. Okay? There's a mitral valve, and there's pulmonary and aortic valves. They all do the same thing. Allow blood to only go in one direction. Sometimes people's valves leak a little bit. Have you ever heard of somebody having a heart murmur? Have you heard of that? A lot of people have it as kids, and then they maybe outgrow it as they get older. But sometimes that's caused by these valves not fully closing. And when a doctor listens to your heart, they can hear the blood starting to flow backwards, and that's why it's called a heart murmur. You can detect it just using a stethoscope. So, right atrium, right ventricle. Where's this blood headed? We just said it earlier. Where? To the lungs. This is going to the left lung, this is going to the right lung. This blood vessel that's carrying it is called the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary means lungs. Like CPR, what does the C stand for?
Coronary.
Cardiac.
Pressure. Pulses. Pushing.
Pulmonary. Resuscitation. When you're doing CPR on a person, what are you doing for their heart?
You're artificially.
Yeah, you're compressing their heart. You're pumping it manually. What's the pulmonary mean?
Your pulse.
Pulmonary means having to do with the lungs. That's the rescue breathing. You inflate a person's lungs with air from your own mouth. Resuscitation means to restart. So this blood's heading out to the lungs. Eventually it's got to come back, but where does it come back? Went to the lungs, coming back,
Left side.
has to come to the left side, into the left atrium. This blood's coming in from the left lung, this blood's coming in from the right lung, into the left atrium. It gets squeezed down into the left ventricle, and then pumped out. Where's all this blood going?
The rest of the body.
Rest of the body. This is the aorta. It's the biggest artery that leaves the heart. These branches, they go to the right arm, the left arm. This goes up to the head. The aorta loops around, heads down to the lower parts of the body, distributing this blood to all the places it needs to go. And that's the overall picture of circulation in our circulatory system. It always goes from the body to the right atrium, left atrium to the lungs, back to the left atrium, left ventricle, then out to all the parts of the body. Now we're going to stop there for today in our notes, but I want to show you that